Recently, a storm uprooted this tree, which took out the utility lines, which left us without power for 24 hours. Now, I do have 2 battery backup systems, this Vector, which can run our side-by-side refrigerator for about 7 hours, and this Milwaukee, which kept the tankless water heater running. But as we approached 24 hours, we realized that these weren't practical solutions because the Vector needs about 5 hours to recharge. Likewise for the Milwaukee. Yes, I could buy a gas generator, but then I have to deal with the oil and fuel and the maintenance of running that system. And then I realized I already own a gas generator. It's this 2014 Prius. And in this video, we're going to go step by step on how to convert this into an emergency generator for your home. For those of you not familiar with a hybrid system, its really basic components are a gas engine, an inverter, an electric motor that can be used as a generator, and there's a traction battery on board. So what happens is the gas engine can drive the wheels, any excess energy is fed through the inverter to the traction battery. The traction battery can also feed energy to the electric motor and drive the car on its own or in combination with the gas engine. The other thing that this inverter does is it charges the 12-volt auto battery. The ability to draw power from the traction battery through the inverter makes this an ideal system for emergency power. Let me explain. So we know that this inverter will take power from the traction battery and feed it to the 12-volt battery and keep that charge. So if we attach a inverter to that 12-volt battery pack and convert that to 120 amps, now we have external power that we can plug in and run a refrigerator. As that battery starts to deplete, this inverter draws power from the traction battery and maintains the charge of that 12-volt battery. So that battery won't deplete. What happens when the traction battery depletes? Well, this engine will kick on, recharge the traction battery. Once it's done that, it'll shut down, and then the inverter continues running power to the 12-volt battery. So the 12-volt battery never runs out of power as long as you have gas and your engine fires up. And that's the whole system. So basically, it's kind of a maintenance-free generator because it only runs when it needs to charge the battery pack, the high voltage battery pack, and that through the inverter will maintain the 12-volt battery pack, which is feeding your external inverter, thus generating power for you to use in a house. Here are some of the products we'll probably need for this project. Starting off with the Nature Power inverter. This one's rated at 1,000 watts. It is a pure sine wave inverter, so it's better for powering electronics. And it also includes this ground fault interrupt. It's built into it and a USB output. The reason I chose 1,000 watts is the DC to DC inverter on the Prius outputs 125 amps. And at 14.5 volts, that equals 1,812 watts. 1,000 should be plenty for what we need to do. We want to fuse the positive side coming off of this into the battery. I purchased this circuit breaker, which is rated at 100 amps. And it has a quick disconnect function, so it serves both as protection for the circuit, and if I just need to turn it off really quickly, I can press that button. To make our cable connections, we're going to need a crimping tool, a big one, because they're thick cables. So for the lugs, I got a hydraulic crimper. Got some Anderson connectors, which will allow me to break away from the battery very quickly so that this becomes a portable unit, so I don't have to leave it in the car. Whenever I need it, I can just bring this to the car and via this quick connect, make my connection. I also got a smaller quick disconnect for the ground wire that's coming off of this going to the body of the vehicle. We have a box of shrink tubing and a bunch of little lugs that we may or may not need. I got a tool here for cutting the sheath and just basically stripping the big cable. Speaking of big cable, here we are, 4 gauge. It's welding cable. It's solid copper strands, which makes it highly flexible and allows you to use 4 gauge as opposed to like a 2 gauge. If you're using strictly battery cable, the strands would be thicker, they'd be harder to move, but you could get away with like a 2 instead of a 4. Whereas with welding, it's stranded, it's more flexible, and you can get by with a 4 gauge as opposed to a 2. I will need a cutting tool for that cable, so purchase more of those. More SHRINT tubing. We have some big number 4 copper lugs that we'll be using. A wire cutter for the ground wire. Might need a voltmeter, so you can go either old school analog or digital, whatever your choice. Also need a crimping tool, and this Lyman's plier just happens to have that feature built in there, so I can use that. And finally, I got some wiring that I pulled out of an old dehumidifier, and it just happens to have a very flexible 18 gauge ground cable, which I can connect to this and then to the vehicle. So I'm going to strip this cable out of here, and I think that's all we're going to need. So let's get to work. The 12-volt battery is located on the passenger rear side of the vehicle. In order to gain access to that, we need to remove the carpeting, storage panel, storage bin, and finally the battery cover. We lift up and pull out. Now that we have access to the battery, we need to determine how much cable we're going to need. So I'm going to go from here, underneath this panel, come out of the tail light access panel. You see our cable goes through the tail light panel, and I have a choice. I could either cut out a piece of that panel to let the cable through, or I can just snake it underneath. At this end here, we'll put our fuse, and there'll be a short lead coming out to the Anderson connector, and then the rest of the cables going to the inverter. On this side, I put this panel back in, making sure that nothing's getting in the way. This cable comes down, goes to the positive side. I'll put a lug, and I can actually tap into either the side fastener or the one on top. My lug will fit either one. So I'll probably go with the side, since I might not have to do any cutting of this guard. I have placed 2 marks on the cable. This one is where I'm going to cut the cable, and this is how far back I have to peel the insulation off to fit into the lug. So we get our KLIEIN tool, and it's brand new, so I've just added a little oil to it. Get right on that mark, and nice clean cut. With stripping tool in hand, I insert the cable, making sure it lines up with my mark, and I twirl, and this should cut through the insulation without damaging the strands, which would be harder to do with just your typical wire cutter. And if I put this off, we can see all the strands are in place, and so we have success. You don't want to damage the strands on the cable. Next, we grab our lug, we place it over the end, and we know that this copper strip will go right to the end of the lug. So we'll place that in there, making sure that we don't catch on any strands. And now all I need to do is use my crimping tool, which could be a challenge because you really need 2 hands to do this. So I may have to wait for someone to come home. And the thing that you want to avoid is that as you're crimping, you don't want this to start sliding out. You want it to make sure it stays up against the insulation. This crimping tool applies up to 10 tons of pressure. So once it's done, I release the tool and it looks like a nice clean crimp, but it's not because it slid right out. So obviously this needs to be a little bit tighter for it to work. Since our crimping tool wasn't really getting a good bite, I saw a trick where you take a screwdriver and then you pound in on one side, come over on the other, put a little notch, and now it doesn't come off. Now I'm going to put a little bit of shrink tubing on it, and I'm going to make sure that I go over the beginning of the lug so that it's completely sealed. After using a hairdryer to shrink the tubing, I'm ready to deal with the other end of the cable, and that's the part that's going to go into the fuse. And in this particular fuse, the ends on cap, and there's an opening with a barrel inside that has a screw going through it. I can remove the barrel, which I probably will have to for this size cable to fit in, and then that screw will press down on the cable and hopefully hold it in place. So first thing I have to do is strip back the insulation so that it fits exactly the length of this opening. To help me get the exact measurement, I put an Allen key in, and we're going to remove the little barrel that's inside. And you'd use that little barrel for smaller size wires. That comes out. And now I can put my cable in here and see how far it will travel. Nope, I can't. That was a bad idea. Using an Allen key, I loosen the lockdown, and that takes out the little sleeve that's good for a thinner cable. Now, my cable is probably too thick with the insulation on it just to slide in, and indeed that's the case. So now I'm going to estimate that it's about that far in, mark my cable, and then we're going to cut that piece of insulation off. Before we can insert our cable in here and secure it in place, can't forget about this sleeve. It's going to go over. Now there is a grommet on the end of it, but the grommet's too small for our cable. So we're going to put this cover over the cable before we mount it to the fuse. And I'm also going to put some heat shrinking down here so that it's in position for after I make my mechanical connection. With sleeve in place, shrink tubing in place, we are ready to see if this will fit all the way in. And as you can see here, I'm going to need to cut off just a little bit. It's just a little bit too long, so maybe an 1/8 of an inch needs to come off this end. So we'll trim it and then try again. After trimming, we try to insert again, and I always rotate a little bit so that none of the strands get caught. And as you can see, that is flush to the insulation. So now we can take our Allen key, tighten this down, and I make sure that I hold the cable in place while I'm doing that so it doesn't slip out. And I'm going to go with the long end of the Allen key just to get a little bit more torque on this. And the idea is you should be able to tug on this and it shouldn't come out. So satisfied with that, I'm now going to move the heat shrink over that and seal it down. With the cable mechanically bounded to the fuse and shrink tubing in place, we put in our sleeve, snug it up, and this part of the cable is done. Now we need to come out of this side, and this is going to go to the Anderson connector. For connecting to the fuse, it's a similar thing as what we did here. We're going to take out the smaller size barrel. We're going to cut this to the proper length so that it fits in there. Shrink tubing, the shield. With our fuse all assembled and connected, we're ready to move on to the Anderson SB120. I will need 15/16 of cable to go in here. So I've decided that my cable length is going to be here. So I'm going to use that much going into this connector. And then we will crimp this to this cable. So first thing I need to do is make my cut here and then cut back this installation so it'll fit inside. Putting on the Anderson connector, we see a little bit too much wire showing, so we'll have to trim it back. And now it seats and meets the installation. Now we need to crimp the Anderson connector. So you got to make sure that the connector is snug up against the cable. And as you go to push down on the tool, you got to make sure that that positioning doesn't change on you. Again, it helps to have 3 hands when you do this. With the connection crimped, this can go into the Anderson connector. Now it's red. They do have polarity on these, minus plus, so this is going to be on the plus side. The flat side of this lug is going to go on the flat side of this. And that's the best way to remember it. And you just simply insert and push it all the way in, and it's now locked into place. Now what's left to do is we grab the remaining cable. We're going to add another Anderson pin to it. That's going to go into this connector, which will eventually mate with this one. And then the opposite end of this cable will go into our inverter. So at this point, we just strip insulation, make this connection, crimp it down, and then remember flat side, positive cable, slide in, clicks, and it's locked. So at this point, all I have to do is attach a lug that's going to go onto the inverter. For my 18 gauge ground wire, one end already has a lug on it. I cut the other end, tinned it. I'm using the Ideal power plug, and that allows you, if you strip 3/8 of an inch and you tin it, you should be able just to push this in, and it should stay once it's fully seated. And so now I have a connection. I do the same thing to the mate of this plug, and then when I need to make a connection, I just clip them together, and when I need to take that connection apart, I just pull on it. So this is great because I'll have a pigtail coming off the inverter, And then this I'll leave in the car, connected somewhere on the frame. And so I'll just simply plug in and I know I have ground. For the grounding cable, I needed an attachment point on the vehicle, and this one here is part of the vehicle ground. I took my voltmeter, put it in continuity, touched that piece of metal, touched a bolt, and I got tone, so this is part of ground. I found a lug that fits the fastener that goes into that attachment point, so I will be able to attach my wire to this, and we're set to ground the inverter. I've cut my ground wire to the appropriate length. I've put some shrink tubing on. I got the lug that's going to fit, and I put that over and just make sure there's a little bit of copper sticking out the other end. Then I get a crimping tool and we crimp. And an old timer told me you always crimp twice to make sure it's not going anywhere. So double crimp. We have a good connection. Doesn't want to come out. And now I'm going to put this shrink tubing over that. So one, it just protects everything that's been crimped, and then it'll look a lot nicer. Back at the vehicle, we attach the fastener with the lug and ground wire. Tighten that down, and now because we have our breakaway connector here, I can easily separate from that ground when I need to take the inverter out. Having made up our positive cable with the fuse and connectors on it, it's much easier to make up our negative cable, which will have the shrink tubing, the lug. It won't need a fuse, so we'll just accommodate the length for the Anderson pin into the connector, and of course our shrink tubing. Now, as you know, there's a difference between the negative and the positive post distance wise, and that's 7 inches. So I can actually deduct 7 inches from my negative cable, and then these will travel as a complete pair, meet here with identical length, because we've made up the difference between the positive terminal and the negative terminal on the battery. Here's a quick tip when stripping. If anything, cut longer, because it's easier to use the cable cutter and cut off any excess, as opposed to just trying to get, an 1/8 of an inch more insulation cut off with this tool. So if you need 5/16, cut 1 inch. And that way, if it's too long, you just snip off the end. Once you complete the cable going from the battery to the fuse to the Anderson connector with both positive and negative, you're ready to do the same to the cable that's going to go from the Anderson connector to the inverter. So I lay down the negative cable, which is black, next to the positive, which is already attached to the Anderson. I determine my length. I'm going to mark it. I'm going to put a lug on it. The only thing you should know is that you might want to make sure that the orientation of that lug is going to work correctly, so that when it goes onto your inverter, if they're both perpendicular, they line up perpendicular. You don't have one vertical and one horizontal. So that's about the only catch with that. But yeah, I will cut the cable, add my lug, and of course shrink tubing. The lugs that I'm using are copper. They're made for 4 gauge. They're 5/16. That's the opening. And I'm using this hydraulic crimper. The crimper calls for a die number 25 for 4 gauge, but I've discovered that that doesn't crimp enough. So I went with the next size down, tighter, so it's a die 16. So that's a tip if you're using this particular hydraulic tool to crimp, and you'll find lots of these online. They may have different names, but it's basically the same look. So it will work. I just needed a 16 die to do this 4 gauge. Interestingly enough, I had to use the 25 die to do the Anderson connectors. With the Anderson to inverter cables made, shrink wrapped, and now attached to inverter, all we have to do is attach our ground, and that takes a number 2 Phillips screwdriver to take that fastener off. Then I have a lug here that's closed off, and that'll attach, and of course it has a connector on the end. With the ground wire attached, you can see that the connection goes off to the right. It doesn't go down because it would hang up on this plastic, so it makes it a little bit more cleaner and just keeps it in line with the other cables. When completed, your cables should look something like this. For those of you who are interested in numbers, it was about 26 inches from the battery to the fuse block. From there, it's 5.5 inches to the connector. The negative was 26 inches long, and then on the inverter to the Anderson connector were about 31 inches. I had maybe that much wire left over from the black, and I don't know if I had any red left over. I may have used it all up, but 5 feet cable should be plenty for this project. So now all we have to do is connect these to the battery terminals, and we'll be able to put this in operation. Now we have to connect our harness, and to do that I'm going to take the cable, drop it down behind where the taillight opening is, come down here. I'm going to attach the positive first because that'll decrease the chance of something going wrong. And of course, we want to make sure that our fuse is open so that should the negative touch something, nothing grounds out. So this is a number 10 because it's a Toyota. So simply take that off, attach our lug to there, and then on the negative side, the fastener is on the trunk side. So I'm going to have to play around with getting to that, but I'll loosen the fastener and my cable will come off the back side and then go up, come out here. First things first, we have to loosen this 10mm fastener. Don't drop the fastener, because then you'll have to take out the whole battery to get to it. As you see, when properly done, the top cover fits right over. With the positive connected, we move over to the negative, and to really get access to that, you're going to need a wrench. This one has a ratchet on it, so it should be able to break this loose. Because I'm having such a hard time getting in there because of the steep angle, you'll need a wrench with a ratcheting head. One fastener. And be careful, it does have a little square washer on the back side, so you don't want to lose that. Now, of course, the $3 question is, can I just turn this fastener around, put the square on this end, and then the nut? Well, I put the bolt through, the square washer on, and now I'm going to attach my cable and then the nut. And this is far easier with the nut on the inside, which which means, you know, when it comes time to replace the battery, this will be a much easier job to do. The only concern I might have is there's a panel that goes over here. They go up. Let's see, can we get away with this? The ground cable, when I loosened this fastener, came this way, so it's protruding a bit and getting in the way. So I'm just going to loosen the nut, push it back in, and see if we can get away with our cable being in front. Okay, so even with adjusting the cables further back and even off to the side, our cable just still gets in the way of that shield. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the fastener, put our cable behind on the other side, and I think that will get it out of the way, and I can still leave that nut outside of here so that it's easy to access in the future. Our cable, fastener, and this is going on the back side, coming through, flat washer, then the nut. And I think that'll work for us. Okay, so our cable is behind it. Their cable is in the same place, except the fastener is now on this side. And if we get our panel, it's going to fit. Yes, our panel will fit. No interference. Our cable comes through. So now the only question we have to answer is what to do with this opening. Do we cut out a little notch here for the cables to come through, or do we just let it push out? I'm thinking I'm going to notch it out. A few final touches. I put a tie wrap here to guide our positive cable so it's not bumping up against the negative and it's not rubbing against anything. Just a precaution. Then coming out of here, I did notch. I actually notched downwards so that the cable would tend to have a place to fall into. And what you do is you cut above and below, and then you just push it back. It's a kind of fibrous styrofoam, so it will bend back, and it looks like it'll hold in place. So all I have to do now is just attach the different panels. We'll notch in a little bit more. Okay, so our door is good. We just need to Velcro, put a hook, something. I'll figure that out. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the cover in, put all the bins back in place, and we'll see what the final product looks like. As I'm putting everything together, I realize that some of you may want to store your inverter in this bin, or you can even mount it to this bin if you like. I'm not going with that option. I prefer to have the inverter just sitting on top so it gets a little bit more air. I don't want it down low because it will be pumping out heat when it's actually being used. We're almost to the end of this project. All that's left to do is to do some testing. I've mounted the inverter on a cutting board, the reason being that there is a vent underneath, and I didn't want that to sit on the carpeting, so by providing a hard surface, it'll always get fresh air. Our connections, our connectors for grounding and for power. And at the moment, coming from the battery, it's just sitting there. There's this emergency pouch that's supporting it. I'll probably put some Velcro or something so it just hangs there and it doesn't stress. But now I can take this board and put it in the garage, and whenever I need power, it'll be ready. Now, to get power from this unit, obviously I have to run an extension cord, and I can do a short run to this outlet here, which feeds a quad outlet on the other side of this wall, so that brings power into the home. From there I can hit the main appliances that we want to run when we have an outage, which would be the refrigerator and the tankless water heater, and maybe charging one of our battery packs. Of course, I have the ability to also run a power cord into the house, but I think this will be much more efficient. As far as the vehicle goes, it would be sitting outside, and so there would be a short cord that goes across underneath the garage door so that the vehicle vents outdoor and no fumes are introduced into the home. So it's finally time to ask the question, will it smoke? We're going to connect our ground wire. We're going to connect our Anderson connectors. We're going to turn on the circuit breaker. We're going to turn on the car. And you can hear the engine coming on. It's beeping because I have the keys out here. We've turned off the AC. The headlights are off. Now we can turn on the inverter. And we see that it was getting 14.3 volts, 14.4 volts. I'm going to plug in this fan. We're going to turn on the fan, and you can see there's no draw at this point. And there it is, drawing power. 0.02 amps. So this is electricity being taken from the traction battery, which is a high voltage battery, being converted from DC to DC 12 volt, coming to the battery, going into the inverter, being converted to 110, 120 voltage. I've just plugged in our refrigerator. Here, I'll show you. No lights. Plugged it into a 14 gauge extension cord. And that's going out to the car that you can hear running at the moment. And we're going to plug it into the inverter. Here's the other end of that extension cord. Let's see, we're going to plug it in right here. And the numbers, voltage drops a little bit, goes back up. And we're using 0.06. Now let's go over and check the refrigerator. We see the refrigerator is on and it's running. So it's being powered by the inverter on this Toyota Prius. Now, as you can see, I'm actually running the car in the garage. Both bays are open at this point. In reality, we would put the car outside. You just heard the car cycle down because it is finished putting enough charge on the traction battery, which, as I said before, then powers the 12 volt, which then runs the inverter. Inverter feels cool. Our fan is still running. The refrigerator is still running. So conceivably, with a full tank of gas, we could probably run for several days. And that's all my missus really cares about, is just having unspoiled food and being able to take a hot shower. When you're done, turn off power. I have a refrigerator, so I really can't turn that off, but I can turn off the inverter. And now I can disconnect that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the car. Go to the circuit breaker and trip it. And now there's no power coming down that line, and I can safely disconnect my Anderson connector. If you found this video interesting or useful, Give us a thumbs up, leave us a comment, join the subscription team. Tell us what you would do differently or better. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.